You're listening to episode 190 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Dr. J. Michaelson joins us to speak about his new book, Evolving Dharma, Meditation, Buddhism, and the Next Generation of Enlightenment. Hi, everyone. Before we get started with today's episode, I want to remind the listeners that we've started a new podcast, which may also interest you. It's called Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science, and appears every other week, alternating with The Secular Buddhist. You'll find many of the same guests you've enjoyed and learned from here, as well as new researchers, teachers, and practitioners. You'll find Present Moment in the Science and Medicine section of iTunes, in Natural Sciences, or just do an iTunes search for mindfulness and look at the results in the podcast section. You can also visit the website, presentmomentmindfulness.com. Thanks for checking it out, and if you like what you hear, please feel free to share it with others. As we continue to explore how Buddhism is finding ground in contemporary Western society, we run into the question of enlightenment. As a follow-up to our previous episode with Kenneth Folk, we're going to take another look with Dr. J. Michaelson as he discusses what he's discovered while researching his new book. Jay is the author of 5 books and 200 articles on religion, sexuality, law, and contemplative practice. Jay is a longtime LGBT activist who has held positions at the Arcus Foundation and Political Research Associates. Jay's work in this area has been featured on CNN, NPR, and in the New York Times, and he has been included on the Forward 50 list of the most influential American Jews and the Huffington Post's list of leading LGBT religious voices. Jay holds a JD from Yale, a PhD in Jewish thought at the Hebrew University, a BA from Columbia, and an MFA from Sarah Lawrence. He has also trained extensively in Theravadan Buddhism, including several long retreats in the United States and Nepal. Jay has held teaching positions at Boston University Law School, Harvard Divinity School, City College of New York, and Yale University, and is currently an advisor to the Varieties of Meditative Experience project at Brown University. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice pumpkin spice tea. And our guest today is Dr. J. Michaelson. Jay, thanks for being here.
Great to be here. Thanks.
So we're going to be speaking about your brand new book, Evolving Dharma, Meditation, Buddhism, and the Next Generation of Enlightenment. But before we get into that, I want to ask a little bit about your background. Tell us about your experiences with meditation.
Sure. So I really started on the contemplative path as a professional voyeur. I was in my college years and then graduate school studying mysticism and meditation and contemplative practice as an academic. And I was involved then, as now actually, in kind of comparative studies and looking at different mystical experiences and contemplative practices. And it really wasn't until a little bit later, till right after my 30th birthday, that I started meditation myself. And I guess I was in it in the very beginning, not for sort of Buddhist-y reasons, not to alleviate suffering, and not really for secular reasons either. It was actually kind of mystical, spiritual reasons. I wanted to have fantastic experiences. which I eventually had and got over, and we can talk about that a little bit. I had been fascinated by these accounts of contemplatives throughout the ages. And when I did finally start meditating about 12, 13 years ago, I thought, well, this is great. I'm going to have experiences of angels and, sweetness and light and so forth. And as I'm sure the listeners know, that's not really what tends to happen. And there's that Buddhist book, I forgot who wrote it, Who Ordered This Truckload of Dung? That was, that was my experience. That's right, yeah. That was definitely my experience at the beginning, seeing all this stuff. But sure enough, not only did those fancy experiences happen, but the real stuff, looking closely at the truckload of dung and learning from it and hopefully becoming a little bit less of a jerk and maybe a little wiser and more compassionate along the way, that really got me hooked. So I got into a little bit more serious practice after a couple of years. I did some long retreats. My longest retreat was 5 months, actually a 2 month and a 3 month back to back, and did a few kind of extended sits like that, really to see what was possible in the mind. And over time, my interest in the woo-woo, I would say, declined pretty steadily. I've had some incredible experiences that easily qualify as, off the charts mystical experiences, but ultimately all those pass and they're not really that, they're transformative and they're important, but they're not the real juice. And so I got into much more of paradoxically, a more traditional mindset, but I didn't see it that way. Just the mindset of how is it possible to upgrade the mind a little bit and do what, a friend of mine calls brain hacking, to really change some of the capacities of mind. And that's where I am now. And now, as I teach a little bit of meditation and I certainly practice, and I see it now more as a form of contemplative fitness or, almost a mechanistic process that happens to the brain, much more than anything that gets understood as spiritual.
So, Jay, how do you feel about this latest trend for the scientific studies about what happens in the minds of meditators? Are you seeing that as a harmful thing to Buddhism or a good thing in understanding how the mind works?
Well, it's a harmful thing if you treat Buddhism as a religious set of rules and conducts and traditions, and it's certainly getting corrupted. If anyone has an idea of the purity of the Dharma, they're either getting more and more pissed off, I think, because of what's happening. And they are. I know some of these people, and they're not happy that millennia-old contemplative tradition is being extracted out of its cultural context, its religious context, and being done in a lab. That's not exactly a maintenance of a religious tradition. But that's never been my agenda. I come out of the Jewish tradition as well, and my Judaism isn't like that either. I'm not particularly interested in preserving myths and structures. I'm really much more of a pragmatist. And, we can all cherry pick our favorite Buddhist quotes, where the Buddha says things like that too. I think I'll refrain from that at the moment. But there certainly are strands within the tradition that are pragmatists and that are interested in what these practices can accomplish in a functional sense. And from that perspective, I see the science as very positive for two reasons. First, it is helpful to understand what goes on in the brain, I think, not just behaviorally in a clinical setting, but also neuroscientifically, like what's really happening in the brain. But second, as a perspective on practice, I think when we go to the gym, we sort of have some vague idea. I'm realizing at this moment how little I really know about the anatomy of working out, but we have some basic idea: lactic acid, muscles tearing, repairing. Anyway, we have some idea that what's happening is a mechanical, a physical process. Then we go, and whether the workout is good or feels really good or not, we know that we're contributing to these physical processes unfolding. And I find that outlook on practice to be really helpful. I find that not to be a diminution of what I'm doing when I'm on the cushion, like, oh, it's lowering it down to some material level. I actually find that as really helpful. That, how many times, I know as a teacher, folks will come and say, oh, I had such a lousy sit, I couldn't get quiet. Well, that's not the point of the sit. You don't have to be getting quiet. Just every time you come back, if it's 1,000 times in a 45-minute sit, that's the work. And I think that perspective, which for me is enhanced by a kind of nuts and bolts approach to what's really happening on the cushion, I think that perspective is really helpful.
Yeah, I would agree. That's one of the things that I find most valuable about the mindfulness movement, to making Cody fingers in the air, is that it really does have built into even those basic definitions and the short programs that say the MBSR of just 8 weeks. shows is addressing some of those key things that we tend to trip on as meditators that maybe in our traditional settings they don't address. There's a shift of what we explicitly talk about and what we explicitly do, and we're not getting as stuck in what we would consider the Dharma, the teachings around it. Is that something that you're finding as well?
Yeah, I do find that, even from the beginning, my practice, my Buddhist practice is Theravadan Buddhist practice, kind of in the westernized IMS, Insight Meditation Society, Spirit Rock style. So the non-Goenka Vipassana schools of meditation, which tend themselves to be less ceremonial and even austere. There's not a lot of bells and whistles. You don't even wear fancy robes. You don't have to, there's not like the attention as in, let's say, in Zen context on posture and on form. So I even started out in a pretty bare bones practice, but it's still possible and very easy to get hung up on what bells and whistles there are, and I certainly did myself. I remember one of my teachers, who's a very nuts and bolts teacher, actually a very pragmatic teacher, who teaches in Nepal, where I sat for a while. He would kind of pull out the thesaurus, to parse out the 25 meanings of this or that Pali term, to better understand what's said in this or that particular sutta. And obviously, as a matter of scholarship, that's great. But as a matter of practice, I'm not sure that was quite as helpful as what's the practical effect of this, and how is this happening, and what's taking place, as opposed to what are the 23 ways in which the Buddha might have understood the term tranquility or something. So I find it, even within the most austere, less ceremonial, less woo-woo forms of Buddhist practice, it is good to have some reverence toward the tradition. It's nice to know that there's 2,500 years of smart people, and maybe the idea that I came up with yesterday isn't necessarily right. But along with that reverence comes a tendency to fetishize the tradition that can get in the way of progress.
You mentioned earlier that you started this as an interest in having experiences in part, and you did have those, but that you got past them. And that's something that many of us who are long-term meditators have also had. And happily in the Zen tradition, we're very clear about that. That's makyo, that's a distraction. Just ignore it, keep on with your sitting, bring your attention back to now. Have you found in your experience with the book, there are others who are interested more in the experience, and they do get hung up on that rather than that transformation that we're used to a little bit more as we kind of move on past the experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen it in every strand of Buddhist tradition that I'm familiar with, as well as certainly in my Jewish tradition as well. I literally met someone, he had just started sitting Zen, and he was telling me about his Satori experience. And I was like, well, not wanting to invalidate your experience, but maybe this was just a pretty cool experience, right? And maybe it wasn't the sort of transformative, the really powerful opening that it's designated usually by that term. And likewise, certainly in Theravadan practice, you get a little bit concentrated, and all kinds of wonderful things happen. And I don't want to underestimate the power of those experiences, or I don't want to understate my own stupidity. I spent years with those experiences. I would get into these really nice concentrated mind states and just sort of become like a samadhi jockey. Like, how long could I make it last? How deep? How awesome? How incredible would this string bean taste, and things like that. And I did have well-meaning teachers who were kind of encouraging me, just exactly like you said, come back to now, come back to the, don't keep going to the present. What happened next? Did you notice that it was impermanent, for example, things like that. And I just blew them off, right? Because these experiences were so great. And, I had even done it in a Jewish context, doing kind of Buddhist meditation, but in a Jewish context. And we were told, this was like some kind of experience of God. That's problematic, right? When you're told that a particular experience, this is it, this is the experience, as opposed to every moment being, this is it. And so for me, I found I had to, without sort of talking about other people's practice, for myself, I just had to work it through, and I'd had those experiences. I did do a 2-month jhana retreat, which is, cultivating very concentrated mind states. But it was very clear, what that was for. We weren't doing it just to kind of get off on the coolest experience we could have. It's about purification of mind and how concentration can lead to insight and so on and so forth. And, really just being able to cultivate these incredibly profound experiences and then watch them go it really demystified them. I mean, they were beautiful. And I'm actually apprentice teaching with Lee Brasington, who's a jhana teacher, because I think that's actually a really helpful form of practice. But it's not more than it is. It's a cultivated experience. It comes along. And like you said, the biggest bells and whistles, like, oh my gosh, I think I'm flying and I can't feel my legs or whatever. Okay. And then what? And that, I think, is a really healthy question.
Yeah, and Lee's been a guest on the podcast, and I've had the opportunity to see him a couple of times, not in my home state, interestingly. I always see him in different places. And he's a terrific teacher on the jhanas, and he approaches it in a for one thing, very pragmatic way, that these are deep, concentrated mental states, and neat stuff is going to happen, but really it's about, how does this affect me? How does it change me when I'm not in jhana? And that's really the heart of this. Is we may have a satori experience and we may be in the fourth jhana or the super mundane jhanas or whatever, but if it doesn't really manifest in what you do when you get up off the cushion, that's when it's getting distracted. That's when it might not be the right direction for you. And granted, that's going to take time to unfold, and it's not to disparage the experiences, because they can be transformative. But really paying attention to, okay, how is this working in my life? How is this manifesting ongoing?
Yeah, absolutely. And to give a quick plug for the experiences, because I know you and I agree, but we've so far only said the negative stuff. It is really helpful to get outside of one's conventional ego. And if you haven't, done LSD or mushrooms in your past or something, this is a great way to do that. And just have that experience, just an altered state of consciousness that's so different from the usual, to just see that the way we normally are is a series of habits that can, they come and go, and that it doesn't have to always be that way. I think that's just incredibly helpful. And I've gotten all kinds of insights, both Dharma insights and just content insights, into my stuff in those spaces. The mind gets really, just like I say, malleable and so forth. And you can really, discover a lot. So it's not to put them down. And for me, it's just getting past them wasn't about, oh wow, what a waste of time. Those 3 years of practice was. It was just like, okay, that was great. And now what's next?
So you've been practicing for many years, and you went through areas of interest, shall we say, with your practice, and integrated that into your life. And you've seen ongoing this change, this evolving of the Dharma. What prompted you to write a book about what you were seeing?
So this was really the book I wanted to write. My other books are on different subjects, and my previous one was a fairly commercial book, and it did pretty well. And I felt that the piece that was missing in my other writing was, what was the mental infrastructure that enabled me to kind of do all this other stuff. So for me, the book is meant to chart two parallel evolutions in the Dharma. One sort of public and the other kind of private. The public is what's happening out there in the world, in the Dharma world, with 1 million new meditators in America every year. This is a really remarkable moment. It's just totally unprecedented. We don't know where it'll lead. Most of those people are encountering meditation in secular contexts, in healthcare and in education and so on. And we don't know what it means. And we're coming to this point which I think is a point of inflection. If it becomes increasingly mainstream and clarified kind of what the benefits of mindfulness are in an applied householder life for non-spiritual people, for ordinary folks who have better things to do than go on 5-month retreats, the upside, if we use that kind of econometric language, is incredible. Just the decrease in healthcare utilization costs should lead to a massive increase in the number of people who are encountering these practices. So this is a really important time, I think, to kind of take stock of where we are, how we got here, and where it's going. But there is that other piece. One of my teachers called it kind of a fork in the road, between, on the one hand, applied mindfulness, but then some percentage of us who start doing it in whatever context really get hooked in a good way and want to really deepen that practice. So I think for me, there's this way in which the Dharma evolves in one's own practice. So we talked about one example of that with experiences, and there are others as well. And I wanted to tell that story. I wanted it to be both sides, both the public story, the third person story, and my own personal story as well, which is a first person story. Having both of those, I think, is really essential. And often I think we find one or the other.
Yeah, I think you're right. We take it out of the context and miss the big picture about what is this looking at overall. It's like if we're using our evolution theme here, it's like looking at one animal and expecting we have an understanding of the entire trajectory of where it's been and how the environment is impacting it. And though we may be able to learn a lot, this is a fish, this evolved for water. We might not know a bit more about that, like saltwater, freshwater, all the rest of it. And so we really do need to look at things more comprehensively. And it's an interesting balance because we're looking at it in a very big fashion, keeping those long view eyes on, but also it's how does that relate on an incredibly personal and intimate level with who we are and what we do every moment.
Yeah, and I really think that both sides for me are essential. I think if I would augment your metaphor a little bit, it's not even just a fish, it's like a breed of dog, been bred over centuries to be a certain way. And I think it's natural, you go to some center that calls itself a Buddhist center and you're taught something and that must be Buddhism. But, where does that come from? And just seeing that the way that Zen is taught in America, Tibetan Buddhism and Theravadan Buddhism are taught in the United States is like it's a reform of a reform of a reform. And it's something that, again, was kind of bred. I wouldn't really use that metaphor too much, but, that's been created over the course of time, adapting various teachings to different contexts. And that for me, partly I'm interested in that because I do have a PhD in religion and I'm just interested in it. But partly I'm interested to really see what the choices that were made and why were these choices made and how might we look at them in a different way. And I'll give one example, which is, in the Theravadan tradition, when you practice in Asia, almost all of the centers in Asia, in the Burmese tradition, and even some in the Thai forest tradition, use various maps of contemplative development. They're kind of less famous versions of the Zen ox herding pictures. This is how practice tends to unfold in these different stages. And they're maps. They're not, map isn't territory, but they're these guides to how practice unfolds. When this particular Dharma came to the United States, it evolved by the teachers taking those maps out. They found that, Americans were kind of comparing, my attainment's bigger than your attainment. And was getting in the way of practice. And so those very traditional maps were taken out of practice in this particular form. That itself, that was a very wise decision, perhaps at the time, but that leaves people without any map. And I found it really useful for myself, and I have a lot of Dharma friends who felt similarly, to kind of reapproach some of these models of development and see if they could be helpful, anticipating some of the difficult experiences that come along, and contextualizing some of the fantastic experiences that come along. Some of the stuff that you and I talked about a few minutes ago, the wild and great experiences in the Theravadan maps are called the corruptions of insight. And you get distracted. You see light and you think the light is something special, something divine. And so you just go into the light for a lot of time. And that's, it's helpful that there are folks who traveled this path before and left behind these signposts so that we don't get quite as lost. So that's one example of the way in which the Dharma that it's experienced when someone just shows up at a retreat center is actually been carefully kind of constructed and reconstructed with all this stuff drained out of it and different stuff put in. And for me as a practitioner, knowing that and seeing it as what it is actually really helpful.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I see today is there seems to be an impression that because we're exploring what it means to us within our own cultural context, that automatically means there's an antagonism towards the tradition, and there isn't. There's a great admiration and love for the tradition. It's what many of us had as our core backgrounds and continue to today because there aren't a plethora of secular practice centers to go to once you're, say, through an 8-week MBSR program. The references they give you tend to be Buddhist centers and mindfulness centers. That was one of the things I wanted to ask you, Jay, is what were you seeing in your research for the book as to where people who have engaged with programs like an 8-week MBSR program, where do they go afterwards? Where do they tend to end up for their continued practice?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think where we are now is really different from where we'll be in about 10 years, maybe even 5 years. It's like a hockey stick, the graph of the number of people who are taking up meditation. It's rising at an incredible rate right now. And a lot of those folks are not going to want to go to a Buddhist center with a statue and with people chanting and things like that. And I think we're going to see, right now the only kind of alternative is sort of the sort of new age, right? So you could go to, Esalen or Kripalu or something, and it's not specifically Buddhist, but it's still kind of new age. I think we're going to see more and more. They probably won't call themselves advanced academies. Why don't we call them just Dharma finishing schools for Dharma debutantes to go to?
DharmaDevs.com. There you go.
Exactly. You should grab that URL while we've got it. And I think that there's a real space for that. Again, it's interesting. I'm affiliated now at Brown University with the Willoughby Britton's lab. And she's one of the few scholars on the scientific side who's looking at some of the difficult experiences that arise over extended meditation practice. And Willoughby and I have had a number of conversations about whether you can get to those really difficult stages just through MBSR or secular mindfulness. And she's of the opinion that you can. And she says she actually has people that she's worked with who have gone into, she calls it's like the dark night of the soul, the challenging experiences that come along as a natural part of the path. She says she's worked with people who have encountered those just through, and I would say just, but through secular mindfulness in an applied context. So if that's the case, we're going to need to kind of there will need to be a kind of infrastructure for folks who encounter those kinds of experiences and a way of languaging it and understanding it that fits in a secular context, that's not connected to the Buddhist frame. And I think that's something that I have seen shifting. What I've seen a little bit more, and I think maybe it's just about where we are right now, are alternative communities that are using the Buddhist terminology and framework, but in a pretty unorthodox way. So there are folks talking about these different stages of contemplative practice, but not as, sacred cows, just as, all right, here are some smart people who did these practices. This is the language they used to describe it. Now let's see how that relates to these experiences that I've had and that maybe you as a Dharma friend could help me through or help me understand. And I think in addition to this sort of parallel track of a secular mindfulness, I think we are seeing, not to kind of preach your gospel a little bit, but I think we are seeing a kind of secularized Dharma that still sees itself as Buddhist and within a Buddhist tradition, but which is really helpfully demystified.
Yeah, and I think that demystification, one thing we also run into is that, again, people see that as a bad thing instead of, wait a minute, this demystification, instead of it being filled with the supernatural elements because of its embeddedness in the natural world, to me, that's just so much more inspiring. And granted, that's how I gain inspiration. Others find inspiration from other areas. But that can really appeal to a lot of us who are more science-minded or secular-minded or didn't really grow up with a religious tradition that was an embedded part of our life, or those who have, but have resonated more with a secular approach to things. That's not a bad thing. And I'm also glad, Jay, that you brought up Willoughby, because we've been talking for quite some time to get Willoughby on the podcast to talk about her work. And one of the presentations that she gave last year at the scientific conference from the Center for Mindfulness, which they have every year, was on her work on these experiences. And it was one of the most telling moments. I've seen her give this talk a couple of times, and the same thing happens every time she asks this one question: how many people here have ever been on a retreat and someone in the retreat had problems? And everybody's hand goes up. It's very common. And so to see that, yes, as people do the same kind of contemplative practices, whether it's MBSR or whichever program that they're in, of course, there are some stumbling blocks they're going to run into, more than just, gee, I'm having a hard time focusing. There are difficult things that can come up as well, and we need to be prepared as we create a more secular holding place for ongoing practice to address those and know what to do with them.
Right, and at the same time, not flip out within our secular kind of context. So I remember, I was talking with someone at one point, and just like he was concerned that people were having psychotic breaks and this and that and the other, and not that could never happen, but it doesn't necessarily have to fit in some paradigm of ringing the alarms. Oh, this person's having a difficult experience, therefore it must be a psychotic break that we must medicate immediately. Where the psychoanalytic frame becomes its own kind of religious devotion. And I think that's right. I think for me also, when you look at these traditions, I'm not interested in being an apologist for any tradition or in cleansing it of what's there. In my opinion, reading certainly the Pali Canon, there's all kinds of otherworldly stuff. They're talking about, devas, semi-divine beings, and people get all these magical properties and they manifest these magical powers and so forth. And I'm not necessarily, it's there, the material's there. It's not a part of the focus of my practice. But one of the ways of understanding it is, well, there are these weird things that happen as you go into these kinds of, go into contemplative practice in a serious way. So here are folks in a, kind of pre-modern context in the 6th century BCE northern India, conceptualizing what happens, when you hear voices, for example, or when you see something, you have a visual experience, that can be interpreted as a revelation or a hallucination or both. And so I think it's actually helpful to reapproach some of the religious seeming or supernatural material that's in the text, not to try to believe it or to say, okay, if you don't believe in devas, you're not a good Buddhist. But on the contrary, to say, well, all right, here are folks in this other cultural frame doing their best to understand some of the weird stuff that happens. Now, if we take that away and we're in a different cultural frame, how do we understand that? And how do we work with it in a skillful way?
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is going to be an ongoing area of exploration in Willoughby's work and in others. One of the interviews that I have coming up for the other podcast, Present Moment, is with the folks that are partnered with Sarah Lazar, the Brown Lab, and a number of other folks that have written a paper that's just coming out. So I can't name it. It's not out yet. Hold on to that. But it's really an exploration of, so here's what the tradition says about this stuff and these states, and really what are some ways that we as scientists can effectively translate that so that it's something we can use and measure and show, and how does that contribute to our understanding of what's going on in the brain, and how might this help people within a context that doesn't insist on or have a particular religious structure around it.
And I think we're just getting started. My contribution to the Brown Project, the Varieties of Contemplative Experiences Project, and Contemplative Studies is hopefully bringing kind of a cross-cultural perspective to some of this, because the same kinds of questions arise in other traditions. It's not just, obviously, it's not a Buddhist or a Buddhist and Hindu phenomenon. There are all kinds of unusual experiences that take place in Abrahamic traditions. There are different ways in which, to quote Jack Kornfield, the heart grows wise on the spiritual path. And it's not about just comparing and contrasting or kind of naively saying everything is one, but rather, here are different perspectives on the same set of phenomena. And can we bring together the methodological rigor from religious studies together with the scientific rigor on the scientific side to really say something about these qualities of human development? And, sometimes I think we're a good 20, 30 years ahead of where the McMindfulness world is, which is just trying to teach people to relax and de-stress a little bit at the workplace, which is fine because, we need that lead time. If the relaxing and the de-stressing ends up leading to a dissolution of self, that's one of Willoughby's best case studies. It was literally that, it was someone who they took up meditation to relax. And they started having these ego dissolution experiences that they didn't want, And Willoughby I think it was Willoughby who had to explain to them, this is actually what people work really hard to get.
Yep.
The dissolution of the idea of self, people really want that, And this individual was experiencing it as as a kind of, I don't know, they didn't use the word psychotic, but as some kind of psychological problem. Oh my God, I'm dissociating. What's wrong with me? I'm in trouble. And, meanwhile, they were actually attaining what a lot of people work really hard to get to.
Yeah, Willoughby talks about that within the cultural contexts, that in some cases that's a good thing. And culturally, they're prepared for that. That's okay. Losing self is not quite such a big deal. But in our culture, maybe not so much. And that's a very scary thing. And that's not what we want at all. So, thanks for the reminder. I'll get Willoughby on the podcast soon to talk about that more comprehensively than we are here. Jay, something else I wanted to ask you about is you're also an LGBT activist. and you're one of the Forward 50 list of influential American Jews and the Huffington Post leading LGBT religious voices. And so one of the things I wanted to ask you is, with that particular hat on and that perspective that you bring as you're researching the book, were you finding in Buddhist sanghas an openness and an acceptance of lifestyles, or is that still got a long way to go, or is there some variation based on the kind of community that you're looking at?
Yeah, it really does vary. In the West, as you may have noticed, sitting in various Buddhist communities, American Buddhists tend to be kind of liberal, right? And it's actually kind of an anti-authoritarian thing to do to be a Buddhist or to take on that label. Very few Westerners were raised as Buddhists, and so you have to. If you were raised with a religion, you leave your religion. If you were raised secular, oh my God, you become religious. Either way, it's kind of a rebellious thing to do. And so those folks tend to be more liberal, more, and certainly not just tolerant, but celebrating of sexual diversity, gender diversity. When you look in Asian context, on the other hand, it's not rebellious to be a Buddhist. It's actually traditional to be a Buddhist. And so it's not surprising that a lot of traditional Asian Buddhist teachers have traditional views on sexuality and gender. Yeah, gender even more than sexuality, about roles and gender roles in women and men. And Rita Gross has written a couple of really good books on Buddhism and patriarchy and how that intersects, and how some of it's maintained even in the West, where we have these patriarchal community forms with a lot of hierarchy. But for me, it's interesting. I've spent less time on the Buddhist side, less time with the inclusion, tolerance, acceptance when it comes to sexual diversity, and more with the how does having a queer identity help or hinder on the contemplative path, and what does the Dharma say about. And I think just basically some notions about non-self and deconstructing gender and seeing one's own gender as non-normative, or at least as constructed. All of that kind of postmodern queer theory stuff actually leads to a lot of really helpful Dharma practices as well, and vice versa. It's not too hard for me to see my various identities, which strike many people as a contradiction. How can I be on the secular Buddhist podcast and be listed on some religious leaders list at the same time? For me, none of these are identities. These are different forms and practices and technologies. The religious technologies that I'm interested in, I see as really useful ways to get in touch with where you're at in a particular moment, or a life cycle, or the yearly cycle and things like that. And they're just tools and technology. So it's easy for me to see these different masks or identities as things which are constructed, that is to say, contingent and dependently originated, and things which can be multiple, and none of which is self. I keep looking for myself in each of these masks and identities and not finding it there. So that for me is a really interesting. I think all of us have. I think there's a naive notion sometimes of contemplative practice that you wash away all of your particularity. Gary Snyder there was a book called Zen and Hasidism, a kind of mystical Judaism, and he was asked to contribute. And he wrote back to the editor. It was like he wrote it in kind of blank verse, so it was like as if it was a poem. And he said he was describing his own Zen practice, and he said, in Zen we want to, I'm paraphrasing here, we lose the idea of self, of other, of world, of I am. How could, quote, being a Jew, close quote, be of interest along this path? Kind of an arrogant little statement, but he's Gary Snyder, I guess he gets. Yeah, and I wrestled with that for a long time, actually, on my own kind of multiple path. And I do see it differently. At the end of all of these paths, yes, all these forms of identity are pretty much irrelevant. And if you're still hanging on to any of them, you're probably not at the final stage of the path. But, everywhere before then, I think we can and should bring our particularity to our practice, and the different historical coincidences that led us to who we are, the biases that we bring, the preconceptions that we have. And that's all, for me, that's all grist for the mill. And it's all more material to see that it's not me. So I want to, when it comes, whether it's LGBT identity or whether it's an ethnic or racial identity or a gender identity, whatever that place of identity is, I want to do two things with it. One, sort of hold it, and B, let it go at the same time. And noticing that, the particularity matters, and that it is another form of contingent self that's not really there in a fundamental way. And that, I think, can be a real entry point. I think when you tell a lot of Americans you're going to let go of who you are to do this practice, that's not necessarily skillful. I think it's more useful to who wrote that book, Start Where You Are? Was that Pema, or it was one of the Buddhist celebrities? The book Start Where You Are. You start where you are, and that I think is some of the ways in which these different identities have contributed to my practice.
Excellent. Well, our guest today has been Dr. Jay Michaelson. You can find out more about his work on his website, jmichaelson.net, and we'll be linking that on the episode page, as well as including Jay's books and a couple of the others that we've mentioned here today. Jay, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Ted.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.